Okay, welcome to Arab Talk on KPOO, San Francisco 89.5 FM. And in the studio today, we're going to be interviewing and having a conversation with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. Stay tuned for Arab Talk. All right, welcome back to Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. And in the studio today, we're honored to have Sheikh Hamza Yusuf with us. We're having a discussion with Sheikh Yusuf today, and hopefully we'll be taking your calls. Hamza Yusuf was born in Washington State and raised in Northern California. In 1977, he became a Muslim and subsequently traveled to the Muslim world and studied for 10 years in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, as well as North and West Africa. He received teaching licenses in various Islamic subjects and from several well-known scholars in various countries. Basically, Sheikh Yusuf is the director of the Zaytuna Institute, internationally recognized as a scholar, lecturer, has a show on Arab satellite television.
NBC.
NBC is widely recognized as a scholar and an expert in Islam. Welcome to Arab Talk, Sheikh Yusuf.
All right, thank you.
And I want to remind our listeners, in about 15 minutes, we will be taking your calls. The number is 415-346-5376. And for those of you who are outside our range and listening on the web, the toll-free number is 1-866-405-0200. Ramadan Mubarak, Sheikh Hamza.
Ramadan Kareem.
And, just to remind our listeners that these are the last few days. As a matter of fact, I don't know if I'm correct, but is this the Laylatul Qadr?
It depends on which day, because Muslims started 2 different days. Some people started on Saturday and others started on Sunday. So it depends. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said to look for the Laylatul Qadr, the night of power, during the last 10 days, and particularly the odd nights. So it's tonight's. For us, it's the 27th, and it's obviously most people consider it to be Laylatul Qadr, or the night of power.
So what is the night of power? I mean, what do we expect for the night of power?
Yeah, according to Islamic tradition, all revelations came in Ramadan. So the Torah, the Jewish book, the Gospel, and the Islamic book of the Quran, all were revealed in this lunar month. And as some people might know, all the ancient peoples used lunar months. Solar months is actually a later reduction. And the word month in in English, comes from moon. So that was the way that people determined their time. And so this month is a sacred month in Islam, and it celebrates the idea of revelation, the idea of celestial communication with human beings. And according to Islamic tradition, the entire Quran was revealed on this night, but then over a 23-year period, it was dispersed. It was distributed to the heart of the Prophet, but it actually came down to the world on Laylatul Qadr, or the night of power, the night of the decree, the night of fate.
So what's going on? I keep hearing about, because we're talking about the lunar months now, I keep hearing that people want to fix the date of the beginning of Ramadan and the Eid.
Yeah.
Now, where do you stand on this position? Do we follow the ancient tradition of having someone sighting the moon, or do we set a date for it?
Well, it's a good question. The Prophet Muhammad ﷺ said, "Sumu li ra'yatihi," fast when you see it, and break your fast when you see the next moon. And he used the word "see." And there's another hadith, "La tasumu hatta tarahu," don't fast until you see it. So he used the negative and the affirmative in the command. So historically, people went out and looked for the new moon, and it's considered an obligation on a certain group of people to do that every month. The Jewish tradition also follows a lunar calendar, as you know, and they historically also used naked eye sighting. In the 4th century, they abandoned naked eye sighting, 4th century Christian era, and they moved to calculation. this is something that the Muslims now are beginning to talk about. So it would be an abandonment of the traditional way of doing it. I'm personally, I was taught naked eye sighting, that people should go out and look for the moon, and that's what we're continuing on with.
Sheikh Hamza, assalamu alaikum, by the way.
Alaikum assalam.
Why don't you help our listeners understand the context of Ramadan,
Yeah.
why it's such an important month?
Well, I think Ramadan, first and foremost, I mean, for people out there that are informed by Christian tradition, it's really, for Arabs and for Muslims generally, it's like Christmas for 30 days. It's a very, it's a time of great celebration, a lot of happiness. It's a time when families come together on a daily basis and have very wonderful breakfasts and celebrate this. From a spiritual point of view, it's a time of cleansing. Fasting historically is in many traditions. Even Native American peoples fasted. The idea of cutting off from the breast of the world, weaning oneself from our habitual desires. A lot of people are unaware that we have what some people have termed soft addictions. We don't really like to think about them.
Mm-hmm.
Things like coffee and tobacco and television, and it can get more distorted than that.
It's bad for my business television. No,
So Ramadan's really a time of dealing with your soft addictions, of looking at what's really controlling your life and how much willpower do you have. So it's a test of your willpower. It's really I see it as a divine challenge to recognizing really how strong you are as a human being. A lot of people think, God, how do you fast a whole day, don't drink or eat or have sexual relations or whatever? How do you do that for a whole day? Well, we do it for 30 days during the daylight hours, and it's actually, I think people are surprised by
How strong you
how
can
strong
become.
you can become. And the reality of the world, I mean, we tend to forget survival is that's the bottom line in this world. And I mean, African American people know that very well in the United States. Just surviving, getting through the day is a challenge in the world. And so that's what really Ramadan is teaching people, that not only do they have the capacity, but also they should rise to that level of challenge, to take on the challenge of the world. And it's also a time to be in solidarity with poor people, with people that are hungry, feeling the pangs of hunger. It's a useful spiritual exercise to realize, hey, I'm doing this as a willful act of devotion, but there's people out there that feel those pangs of hunger, and we have a planet where it's surprisingly, despite our abundance crops and all these things, there's a lot of people out there that don't have food.
Do you think Ramadan, though, has drifted? I mean, the meaning of Ramadan has drifted away from the initial thinking of it, 1,400 years ago,
Well,
when
yeah.
now we are fasting, but
Sure.
then afterwards we are indulging.
Yeah.
And people in the Middle East are fixated to watching these soap operas and musicals and shows.
Yeah.
And also I feel like a lot of people sometimes they change their lifestyle, like oh, this is Ramadan, I better be good. But I mean, is that, do I feel like just during this month I better behave, and then the rest of the year I can let my hair down, as they say?
Let it all hang out.
Yeah.
Well, I would say, I mean, absolutely. I think there's been a general degeneration of religion all over the world, not just, I mean, human beings were much more connected to the sacred in the pre-modern world than they are today. And there's a lot of abuses as well, but I think we live in a cornucopia of overindulgence on the planet generally. Not everybody, but a lot of people. The Arab world is, despite the hardships and things that are on there, there's an immense amount of abundance in the Arab world. I mean, a lot of Arabs, they eat very well. I would say the average Arab eats much better than the average American. I mean, I
attest to that.
I'll take Arab fast food over American fast food any day of the week. The Arabs invented fast food. They just haven't been able to market it. So, I mean, I would say that there's certainly been a drift. And the fact that many Muslims gain weight during Ramadan is a bad sign.
Yeah, I think my brother is the first to attest to that. I actually...
See, I lose weight.
Me too.
Yeah, alhamdulillah.
I'm not that disciplined.
I'm bragging.
I'm not disciplined.
But, Sheikh Yusuf, what about, are there any regional differences in terms of one's relationship during Ramadan to fasting and celebration?
Yeah, I would definitely. I think that one of the beauties of the Muslim world, I mean, this idea that, Islam is kind of some kind of fascist. Fascism is
or monolithic
monolithic uniformity, and that's the opposite of the Islamic tradition. Muslims were incredibly, I would say, really accepting of cultures, indigenous cultures. I mean, one of the things about the West, we don't really have indigenous peoples anymore, because wherever we went as a people, we pretty much eliminated them, or we domesticated them. Nomads, there aren't nomads anymore. There used to be nomads all over the Western world. There aren't anymore. Whereas in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, indigenous peoples are still there. Now, because of colonization and because of the corporate industrialization of a lot of these countries, you're seeing the indigenous people now really being affected. A place like Borneo and
right.
in Malaysia. But that's actually quite recent, and it's actually from Western influence. So I think you have immense diversity in the Muslim world in Ramadan. For instance, in Egypt, it's almost like you haven't broken your fast if you don't have called amruddin, right? I mean, that's a traditional Egyptian drink. Whereas in Morocco, they use harira, which is their soup that they drink. So you have those type of flavors that are very different. I mean, quite literally flavors.
And I've watched your show, Rihla. For those listeners, Rihla with Sheikh Hamza, or
right.
Journey with Sheikh Hamza, and I've seen you traveling, from Malaysia, and on different.
It's amazing, the diversity
and the different ways people talked and dressed, right. And it's amazing. I mean,
and then only 15% of the Muslim world is Arab.
That's
15%.
Right.
Exactly.
I mean, people
Malaysia
forget,
and India.
People forget 85% of the Muslims are not Arabs, and a lot of them are Europeans. We forget how many Europeans there are: the Albanians, the Kosovars, the Greek. There's 2 million Greek Muslims.
We're listening to the voice of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, who's the director of the Zaytuna Institute. We're engaged in a discussion about, just generally speaking, Islam in Ramadan right now. We're going to take a short musical break and come back and talk to Sheikh Yusuf and maybe even take a few questions. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal, and with us for the entire hour is Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. The number is 415-346-5376, and we're going to be talking to Sheikh Hamza about Islam and Islam in America and all over the world. And I also want to go with a journey or rihla with Sheikh Hamza. We're going to talk to him about his own journey.
Yeah, before we get to that particular journey, I think one thing that most of our listeners don't understand, Sheikh Hamza, is that actually Islam, when it came to the United States, it's not a recent thing.
No.
It actually was, as I understand it, brought over via the slave ships that came from Africa. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Well, there's some research I actually think that the Muslims got here before Europeans, and there is some evidence about that, but that's still a field of research. In terms of African Muslim presence, we know absolutely factually that there were tens of thousands of Muslim slaves that were brought here. They were enslaved in West Africa, and unfortunately partly due to the complicity of some of the African tribes there that would go inland and capture Africans and then sell them to Europeans. But we know, for instance, that about 1/5 during long periods of time, about 1/5 of the African Americans that were brought here were Muslims. And we have, which is a lot. And that's
a lot.
No, it is a lot. I mean, that's, that's been proven. And we've got, in fact, I found a letter that George Washington wrote to one of his handlers, kind of a gopher for him, and he was asking for him to buy some slaves, and he said, "I don't mind if they're Mohammedans."
Mm-hmm. We're going to take a call and come back to this topic here.
Caller, do you have a question for Sheikh Hamza?
Yes, I do, actually.
Yes, please.
I wanted to ask him about the hijab.
What would you like to know about the hijab?
Just its significance and importance. Is it essential for a woman to put on the hijab to reach the highest level of devotion in Islam, or is it possible to attain that without the hijab? There seems to be so much attention on that.
Thank
you for your question. What do you think, Sheikh Hamza?
Well, I think that the hijab has been politicized considerably in our time. It's one of the things about during the colonial period, you saw a lot of this almost lascivious unveiling of Muslims. You have postcards that the French produced out of Algeria of Muslims showing their breasts and with the veil and everything. So there's kind of an obsession with in the West with the veil, with the harem, with all of these stereotypes. Historically, women and men covered their heads in almost all societies. It's a pre-modern phenomenon. Unless you were dealing with Aboriginal peoples, you pretty much found the head covering was just the norm for men and women. Certainly in the Christian tradition, in the Jewish tradition, it's an obligation. In Orthodox Judaism, a woman has to cover her head. Some Jewish Orthodox women get around that by wearing a wig. And so you'll actually see many Orthodox Jewish women have wigs on, but they do cover their hair. In all the pictures that we have, the icons of the Virgin Mary, she's always presented in a veil. Right. And so it's one of the things about, if you look at the animal kingdom, animals always have either fur or feathers. Their skin is not exposed. The only two creatures out there that really have exposed skin are pigs and humans. Now, pigs deal with
Interesting comparison, well, Sheikh Yusuf.
Pigs deal with that by rolling around in the mud. So they actually put a veil of mud on them. Mm-hmm. And humans, it's actually believed that they were honored by clothes. It was a way of honoring them by God. And the Quran says, خُذُوا زِينَتَكُمْ عِنْدَ كُلِّ مَسْجِدٍ. Take your ornaments to every place of worship, meaning your clothes. That it's really an honor to wear clothes. And the idea of protecting women. I mean, one of the things that it's seen as an oppression of women, and in fact, Polly Toynbee, who writes for The Guardian, recently said that the veiling of women is the battle flag of every religion. And I thought, well, the unveiling of women seems to be the battle flag of secularism.
Exactly.
And women are exploited in our cultures immensely. I mean, everywhere you look. And, when the feminists pointed that out in the late 60s and 70s about the advertising exploitation of women, instead of the advertising stop exploiting women, they decide, okay, we'll be equal exploiters. So now we have to see naked men, in their underwear on buses and things like that from Calvin Klein.
Since the caller took us to this direction,
yeah.
I want to bring
It's such an invariable. But I will say to her, there are many deeply devout spiritual Muslim women that do not wear the hijab, and I've met them, and I'll attest to that. But it is considered an obligation in the Islamic tradition. That's what I was taught. My wife covers her head. The face veil, that's a minority opinion.
And this is now a controversy. I mean.
Ripping them off in Tunisia now.
Yeah, all this obsession and what's going on in England.
Yeah, with Jack Straw's statement.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's, there's a friend of mine here in this area who decided to start wearing the niqab, the actual face veil. And initially it really bothered me. And then I just thought, it was incredibly arrogant of me to be bothered by it, because she's an engineer, she's a very educated woman, and she chose to do it herself. She just wanted to do it. And I mean, I really shouldn't have anything to say about
So why do you think we have this obsession? I mean, there is this obsession
I think a lot of Western women do not know that the majority of women that are actually wearing the veils are doing so out of choice. I really don't think they realize that. Now, there could be a problem, and granted, I accept this, that maybe the religion is wrong. Maybe it is oppressive to women. That's a proposition. I mean, I obviously as a Muslim don't accept that, but I accept that being raised as a question, and that needs to be looked at. So, but I just think this obsession, one, it's very troubling. I think people are disturbed by devotion, especially in a world that has become so hedonistic, and religion is so marginalized, what Stephen Carter calls God as a hobby. You know, we've marginalized God to the garage. We can tinker with God, but woe unto you if you bring him out into the public space. And I think also, I mean, one of the interesting things about women modesty, there's a Jewish woman that wrote a book on modesty and said that she actually felt that anorexia was a way of protest, of the soul's protest against the exploitation of the body. And so that women, these famous women who are complete pieces of meat, bought and sold, they end up becoming anorexic as really a spiritual protest unconsciously.
Yes.
That is, I'm going to make myself so ugly that when you see my flesh, you're going to feel revulsion instead of attraction. And I think it's an interesting just psychological insight.
You're listening to the voice of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. He's in the studio with us. And if you'd like to ask him a question, you can call in at 415-346-5376 or toll free at 866-405-0200. What do you make of Jack Straw's statement? I mean,
Well,
to me, it seemed outrageous, frankly.
I mean, I think our leaders have been such an incredible disappointment. I mean, I don't know what to say. I mean, I just wonder how these guys got into the positions that they've gotten into. It's beyond me. Because if I was just a middle manager accepting applications and doing job interviews, I don't think most of these people they just wouldn't get beyond the first interview. I wouldn't call them back. And I'm just curious, is it just voter apathy that has enabled these people to really rise to these positions? It's something very troubling. And to be fair, I have to put religious leadership in there as well, commercial leadership. I mean, I'm just really troubled by the current leadership. I think we've had a major failure of leadership on all counts.
Islam is the fastest growing religion now, and
that's what they say. I think we have more babies than anybody.
Yeah, and yet, I'm seeing more and more people that are ignorant about what is the religion is all about, and we are now what people might term in a clash of civilization, which of course I don't agree with this. Why do you think this rift or this gap is widening?
Well, I think partly what we're seeing is a collapse of civilization, and I think part of what's happening is Islam has been the Cold War warrior of the West for over 1,000 years. One of the things Arnold Toynbee in 1947 wrote a book called Islam in the West, and an essay, and in that essay he actually says long before communism was the bugbear of the West and the scapegoat upon which we thrust all of our fears, Islam played that role. And so, you know, he was living at a time when Islam had fallen into a slumber, but he was warning that Islam may wake up again. And he actually thought that it would become a banner for the brown peoples, because he thought that race war was a very possible inevitability, and felt that Islam would take up that banner of the oppressed peoples of the South. And I think a lot of people are using it in that way. For me, it's troubling because Islam is a deeply spiritual religion, and the political aspect of Islam is not central to the religion. It's part of the religion, but it's not central to the religion. In terms of ignorance, I think one of the things we as a people, humans generally, but Western people also, we don't know a lot about a lot of things outside of our own small spheres. And Islam is very alien. It's something, we have a lot of prejudices that we aren't even aware of. I grew up at a time when Muslims were always, real Arabs, R-E-E-L, to give you a little product placement here. Real Arabs, which is a film about how Arabs have been portrayed.
Based on, just to tell our viewers, based on the book written by Jack Shaheen.
Jack Shaheen, yeah. So I think, people have seen that even in Lawrence Valentino, the Sheik, when he finally gets the woman, she discovers that he's not really an Arab. He's actually a European that got kidnapped by the Arabs.
So, Sheikh Yusuf, maybe before our next caller calls in.
By the way, I'm really happy. Karen Armstrong just wrote a beautiful book. I'm only about a third through it, but it's called Muhammad, a Prophet for Our Lives, for our time.
For our time.
And she's really... and she's a very beautiful, deep woman, but she got to the core of this thing and said, look, this is a man who spent his entire life trying to end violence in Arabia. And for us to thrust upon his religion this attribute of violence is really a disservice to his life, and it's a slander. And she's arguing that people need to become educated about who he was and what he spent his life doing.
Maybe you could, I just want to go back to, we were talking about how Islam was brought to the United States, and I believe the first masjid in North America is somewhere in the Caribbean, or maybe...
You have, there's even indications that according to Cortez, when he arrived in Mexico City, he actually said there were mezquitas, there were mosques in Mexico City, and pagan temples. Quba, in Arabic, as you know, means the dome of the mosque, and some people say it's because they actually saw the
one in Cuba.
One in Cuba.
Right.
So there's an indication that there were mosques early on. In terms of the most historical sites that we have now are actually from the Lebanese. When the Lebanese community came over here, they did build very early mosques, like in Dearborn, Michigan, also in Canada, because there's a significant Lebanese community in Canada.
What have you seen in terms of the evolution of Islam's spread in the United States? I mean, your kind of take in terms of where we are today from, let's say, the turn of the century. Where are we today?
Well, I think you have an unbroken chain of African-American interest in Islam. Some of it has been kind of strange for traditional Muslims, like the Moorish Temple, Noble Drew Ali. You also have the Nation of Islam that kind of had their own version of Islam that was very different from mainstream Islam, and so you had that interest, and then also you had a Sunni tradition in the African American community, like Sheikh Nafi', who was one of the early African American converts from Philadelphia, who actually went to Medina and studied, and his son became a hafiz and now has the Quba Institute in Philadelphia. So you have the African American. You also have the Lebanese, the Lebanese migrations to this country that occurred at the turn of the century with the Ellis Island. They were kind of the first Arabs to come in. Many of them were Christian, but some were Muslims, and they had their little centers and tried to do things. You have the intriguing story of Muhammad Alexander Webb, who was a consul in the Philippines and converted to Islam and started the American Muslim Mission and actually became an ambassador to the Ottomans. And a book by Dr. Omar Abdullah was just written and published by Oxford Press about him.
You're listening to Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal, and with us for the entire hour, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And when we come back, I want to talk to you about your journey, both your personal spiritual journey and the journey that you do throughout the Muslim world.
All right.
Stay tuned. All right, welcome back to Arab Talk on KPOO, San Francisco 89.5. And in the studio with us today is Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And we're going to take another call. We'll take another call at some point, but I know that we have a lot to talk to Sheikh Yusuf about. If you do have a question, you can call us at 415-346-5376 or toll-free 866-405-0200.
I want to talk to you about both your spiritual journey and your show, which is really popular, especially, Rihla with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. And I find that this is my own, at least data, statistics. I find it very popular with the young people.
Yeah, a lot of people are watching it.
This attraction in a time when the people that I've talked to usually, they're the hip hop age group and whatever, but yet somehow you manage to capture their attention. So let's start with your spiritual journey.
Well, my own personal journey. I grew up in the Bay Area, and I'm from a pretty eclectic family. A lot of musicians in my family, and I was exposed to a lot of different influences early on. I had a pretty serious car accident when I was 17, and it was head-on collision with a brick wall. So it just put me in a state for about 6 months where I was really thinking a lot about life and death, and because I really felt that could have been it, and what was it? If life just comes to an end like that, what happens? And I was raised Christian and attended church and things, but I hadn't really given it serious thought, like most young people don't. And that led me to really explore. One of the things my mother told me when I was about 12, she said, the only reason you're a Christian is because you were born here. If you were born in Sri Lanka, you'd be a Buddhist. So don't just assume that everything that you're being taught or told is necessarily the only thing. And that had a big impact on me. And my mother's like that. She's very open-minded. Field's Bookstore here on Polk Street, that was my uncle who actually founded that. It's one of the first metaphysical bookstores. My great-grandfather built the first Orthodox church in San Francisco.
Orthodox mean as in
Greek Orthodox. Yeah, they were kind of the greengrocer kings of Market Street, the Greeks here. My great-grandfather migrated here in 1896, came to San Francisco. And my grandfather helped build the first Greek church in Marin County, which is in Ignacio. So I come from, and then on my father's side, they're Catholic supporters. So I come from a family of supporters of the church. And I got interested in just looking at different religions and studying them. And I actually, oddly enough, thought about Judaism because I thought, Jesus never really renounced his Judaism, that he was a practicing Jew. He observed the Sabbath. He didn't eat pork. And I thought, well, if you really want to follow Jesus, maybe you should become a Jew. And there's a whole group, Jews for Jesus, that do that. And then I got interested in Eastern religions. And actually, Islam was the last on the list.
Really, the last one?
It was the last because I think for most Western people, Islam, we just see it as an aberration. We don't really see it as a spiritual tradition. It's really, there's so many stereotypes that go with Islam. And I just stumbled onto a Quran in a bookstore, and I thought, that's the only religion I haven't really thought about. And so I figured I might as well be fair and just give it a chance. So I picked up the Quran, and it just knocked me out. I really was overwhelmed by the book.
You did not just pick up the Quran and read the Quran, but now, you are
30 years later.
You are a allama, as they say in Arabic. You are a allama in the Quran.
Well, I took it very seriously.
Obviously.
And at an early age, I kind of thought, God, is this a fad? Is this something just like a phase I'm going through? And I thought, I better find out, And so I thought I need to really study it at a deep level. And the more I studied, the more convinced I became. And I'm very comfortable with Islam. I think I've become more comfortable with other traditions as I've gotten older. I think I went through a period where I was very rigid and not really, I lived in the Middle East, and I think you get a very insular worldview living in the Middle East.
I asked a young lady who's a big fan of yours, okay, and she's like, Sheikh Hamza is everything. Like, why do you like Sheikh Hamza? Why? We have thousands of sheikhs all over, And you know what she said? She said, because he is humble. He's like one of us. She watches religiously your show. knows all the different episodes, and she says, because he comes across like he's one of us. غير متكبر. She said that in Arabic,
Well,
he's a humble person.
I mean, I would hope. I mean, I aspire to that because it's a religious virtue, and it's certainly the essence of our Prophet ﷺ. He was incredibly humble. And unfortunately, I think in the Arab world, there's a very strong idea of ubbaha. You know what the Arabs call ubbaha, which is it's a pride. Those are very proud people, and some of the shuyukh, in order to, because you have despotic models, the patriarchal family, the father is a very strong figure. You never, la yukhalif abul awad. You just don't go against dad in a traditional Arab family. And so I think a lot of the shuyukh kind of take on that role of being the more despotic, don't question me because I'm the sheikh. And I think it's just not really healthy.
Or Islamic.
I don't think it is Islamic, and I don't want to blame them because it's cultural. It's something that and it used to be like that here. It's not like people here weren't, and it still is. I mean, we've got very paternalistic leaders.
That's why it's more cultural.
Now
it's culturally driven.
The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he was very approachable. He was
incredible.
He was a people's man.
Yeah, beautiful. I mean, there's so many wonderful stories. The woman, the Adi ibn Hatim, who was the son of Hatim al-Ta'id, the famous generous Arab, wanted to meet him, and he went to see him, and he'd heard that he was a king. And then he saw him, and as he was walking to his house, an old woman came and stopped him, and he stopped and started talking with her. And he said, this is not a king. Kings would never do that. And he was very struck by that humility.
You're listening to the voice of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf studio with us today, and if you'd like to ask him a question, you can call 415-346-5376. Sheikh Yusuf, what is the Zaytuna Institute?
Zaytuna Institute, we're attempting to really establish an Islam that's rooted in America, that it's not Middle Eastern, it's not South Asian, it's rooted in America. For instance, when I became Muslim, I actually became an Arab for a period of time because that's what was the option. When you converted to Islam, you converted also to a culture. So I lived in the Arab world, I learned Arabic, I wore Arab clothes. I still sit on the floor in my house because I like it better. So there are things, and I do prefer Arab food to most Western food.
You're kind of thin for that, though, Sheikh.
I know, yeah. But
anyways, the Zaytuna Institute.
So the Zaytuna Institute is, I think, an attempt to create a seminary in America that is conversant with American culture and civilization. And so we want to see native imams emerge because we bring a lot of people over from the Middle East or from South Asia, and a lot of them very decent people, but they're very culturally they're just completely
in shock.
I think it's, to a certain degree, and also just unable to really speak to the young people. I mean, we have drug issues, we have sex issues, we have all the problems that the American culture has. And in the Middle East, although it is changing, there are major transformations going on in the Middle East also, still those things it's all under the table. It's not like in your face as it is in this country.
And this is really important, going back to your program Rihla, when you travel around and you talk to these young people about these different issues.
Yeah.
I mean, these are issues that normally are not discussed on Arab TV.
Exactly.
Especially from a religious perspective.
Yeah.
So what struck you the most when you talk to these different young people, let's say, in United Arab Emirates and versus going to Malaysia or...
First and foremost, I'm always struck by the incredible intelligence that we have in our community. I'm very amazed to see how many intelligent thinking young people are out there. Arabs are a very, very... They're just very engaging people. They engage with their times. There's a lot of conversation that goes on. They talk a lot about things. I mean, maybe too much. Sometimes it's almost stereotypical. But there is real conversations going on. And sometimes some of the religious leadership, they're just alienated from those realities, and so they don't address them. And so I think partly why my program struck a chord was because that's what we were doing. And also because as a convert to Islam and somebody who's coming from the outside, I think I have some fresh insights about the religion that maybe they don't really see anymore because فَطَالَ عَلَيْهِمُ الْأَمَدُ فَقَسَتْ قُلُوبُهُم. Sometimes as time passes, people forget what they have. And so I think a lot of Arabs are really not really aware of this incredible precious gift that they have, which is this religion. And so just to remind them of that, I think, from somebody who's seen both sides of the fence.
Now, from a Western view, many say Islam is not compatible with modernity.
Right.
But, when you go there, you don't see that. How come?
Well,
I mean,
think,
where do we stand on this issue?
I think it's a good question, and I think in some ways I don't think our souls are compatible with modernity. I mean, I think the modern world's driving a lot of us mad. People aren't well. I see people. As I was parking my car, there was some guy who was furious with the person in front of them, and I see that every day on the road.
Road rage.
Road rage, and people, they're not well. When I look out there, I don't see happiness. I don't see people that seem to really be thriving in their lives. I see a lot of really quite depressed faces, and I think there's an immense amount of the drug use in our culture, the antidepressants, the alcohol, all things. I don't think people are well, and I think modernity is it's been difficult. It's a difficult road. We're isolated from each other. We have cell phones on the bus. You've got people talking in their cell phone, and they wouldn't say anything to the person sitting next to them. And so we're very alienated from each other. There's a lot of alienation going on.
So it's not necessarily Islam not fitting in to the West. You're talking about a relationship between Islam and modernity, which is a different kind of analysis.
I think so, absolutely. I think Islam is a very fluid religion. The Prophet ﷺ did not bring statute law. He brought constitutional law. He brought frameworks that are very fluid, and there's an immense room for wiggle room in the Islamic tradition. And I don't think people are quite aware of that because they've taken culture and they've turned it into a religion. For instance, somebody asked an alim in Mecca, he was from America, and he said, how should we dress? The women. And he said, look around Mecca. There's people from Malaysia, Indonesia, Nigeria. Take your pick. They're all believers. And, there's a lot of different ways to be modest. But the essential rule is modesty for both men and women. So you don't have to wear a jilbab and put on this Middle Eastern type of, or the raincoat that they wear in Syria and things like that. There's women here that can dress in American clothes that are just modest. So I think it's navigating new waters for people. In terms of governance, the Muslims, unfortunately, adopted the Persian model as opposed to the Greek model early on. So because they conquered Persia, and the Persian model was a somewhat despotic model. Although it's important to remember that the pre-modern world was far more independent than even the modern world. I would say there was far more freedom in the pre-modern world than there is today. Because the governments couldn't control people the way they can control them today. I mean, they've got thought control. So they tell you what to think. You can't watch Fox News or any of these news agencies. If you hear a speech, they have two pundits on to tell you exactly what he said. So they're interpreting the speech for you.
Even before you think.
It's just amazing.
We're going to take a short musical break, and when we come back, I'm actually going to ask Sheikh Yusuf to talk a little bit about the difference between Shia and Sunni traditions in Islam. So stay tuned. We'll be right back on Arab Talk.
All right, welcome back to Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal, and we're wrapping up with
Time's gone very fast.
Time has gone by very fast with Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, and we've been talking about Islam, Ramadan, and I think now you want to talk more of a contemporary, which I think it's a contemporary issue.
It's a contemporary issue. I mean, if you look in the history of Islam, we never had articles about this written. We never had triangles or regions named after it, but there's a lot of talk in the media about Sunni and Shia and splits and things like that. And I think there is a lot of confusion about it, Sheikh Hamza. Maybe you could help us with that.
Well, the Muslims are broadly divided into Sunnis and Shias. About 85% are considered Sunni, and then close to 15%, and then there's some very small marginalized groups. Historically, the majority of Shia, what are called the Ithna Ashariya, the 12ers, and also the Fivers. There's another group, the Zaydis, who are in Yemen. Has been considered Muslims by the Sunnis. There's never been takfir or excommunication of them. There has been historically the Ismailis, who are the Seveners in the Shia tradition, were traditionally not considered Muslims by the majority of, I think also the Shia tradition, I'm not sure though. But historically, yeah, initially there was a lot of problems, but they settled down like things settle down.
Right.
And then you had periods of time where Muslims have always lived side by side, not just with Sunnis and Shias, Christians, with Jews. I mean, you have unbroken historical communities in the Muslim world. This is one of the things I said. I did a piece called Broadening the Scope of the Pope, which was about the remark that the Pope made in his lecture in Germany. And one of the things I said is, there aren't historical Muslim communities anymore in Europe, unbroken. Muslims were in Sicily for 300 years. You don't have Muslims there that represent those Muslims. Whereas in Palestine, you have the Orthodox, the Armenian, the Catholic, the Maronite, the Coptic. You have all the, even Nestorians. I mean, you have these Christians that people aren't even aware of anymore. So the Muslims always respected them. And we put on our website, zaytuna.org, we put on the letter from the patriarch of Antioch, Ignatius IV, a beautiful letter from Palestine, from Lebanon, saying to the Pope, just look, we know the Muslims. We've been living with them for over 1,000 years. They respect us, we respect them. So I think the fact that Muslims and Christians have lived, I mean, there are bad periods, like Al-Hakim, the crazy ruler, in 1070 when he burnt down the church, and that was later used as a pretext for the Crusades. But he was rejected by the Muslims. So I think the Sunni-Shia split is a political split, but it has never prevented Muslims, Sunnis and Shias from living together.
What is the actual difference between a Sunni and a Shia then, for our listeners?
The essential difference is that the Sunnis believe in the 4 caliphs that came after the Prophet Muhammad in their order: Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, and Ali. The Shia felt that Ali should have been the first because he's a family of the Prophet. So they have more of a connection to the family of the Prophet and believe that the family has a sacred lineage that should have political leadership as well as spiritual leadership. That's the fundamental difference. The Quran is the same. We share many of the same prophetic traditions.
The practice is the same.
They pray the same way. I mean, I could go to a Shia mosque and do my prayer, and it would be the same prayer. I'm Maliki. We hold our hands at the side like the Shia do, so even that would be the same. And a Shia could go to a Sunni mosque, and it would basically be the same prayer. And historically, there have been some separation, but I was taught, because I think there are some Sunnis that are quite rigid about this, but I think most Sunnis are very ignorant of the Shia tradition.
We're going to take
whereas the Shia ulama tend to know the Sunni tradition.
Let's take this call. Caller, you have a question for Sheikh Hamza?
Yes, I do. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Sufism and how it relates to Islam and Shiism and Sunni Islam.
Okay, good.
Thank you for that question. It's a very good question.
Yeah.
What would you say?
Well, I think Sufism historically was a central part of Islam. The idea that the root of Islam is the heart and a spiritual tradition and purification of the heart. I actually wrote a book called Purification of the Heart about that subject. And both the Sunni and the Shia tradition have a spiritual Sufism. In the Shia tradition, they call it the Irfan. In fact, Khomeini did his what we would would call a PhD. He did his dissertation on Sufism. So, and then the Sunnis historically always accepted Sufism. Now, there are extreme Sufis, just like you have extreme everything, that were rejected. But Ibn Taymiyyah, who's always used as a club to badger the Sufis, himself was a Qadri Sufi, which has been proven, and has a whole section in his fatwa called Tasawwuf, the section on Sufism. And he opposed the extremes in Sufism. So I think Sufism is part of Islam. I think it's a sign of ignorance that people just reject it flat out. It's really, I would call it the psychology of Islam.
Now, in a simplistic explanation of the difference between Shiites and Sunnis, I hear more and more that, well, you know, Islam does not have a hierarchy. We don't have a pope. But the Shiites seem to have more of a hierarchy. Do you agree with this statement?
Well, I think in both traditions there's a natural hierarchy that emerges. I mean, ulama are told, you're told to follow them in the Quran. I mean, it says أطيعوا الله وأطيعوا الرسول وأولي الأمر منكم, and those who have authority amongst you. And Imam Tabari says it means the scholars. So there is a hierarchy, but in Shiaism they have the same principle. If a sheikh gives a fatwa, it's non-binding. So do have the idea that the Al-Bayt, the 12 imams, were impeccable. They could not err. So they do believe in the isma of the 12 imams, which is different. The Sunni Muslims do not believe that anybody after the Prophet had infallibility.
Now just quickly, because we're coming to an end here, to a close, do you think there is a systematic campaign to divide Islam, to make people think of just in terms of Sunnis and Shiites and somehow dilute their religion?
Well, the Arabs say farraq tasud. The Latin said divida impera, divide and conquer. It's a very intelligent way for somebody to act who wants to weaken his enemy. So you can't blame people for wanting to do that when they view you as an enemy. And so I think divide and conquer is very effective. One of the things that's always struck me about American prisons is I used to go to the prison quite often, not as an inmate, but as a
I didn't think so.
A minister. But one of the things that really struck me was in the yard you've got the white supremacists, you've got the Mexican mafia, you've got the Bloods and the Crips, and they're all looking at each other with this real animosity. And then over on the walls you have these guards with their guns.
Exactly.
And it's such a metaphor for the world we're living in.
Exactly.
We have these rulers who make money off of our wars. I mean, war is bad for business unless you're in the business of war.
And then you're making good money.
You're making good money. There's people that are happy as pie that people are blowing each other apart. And so when, just to finish this, when you have a society in which the number one industry is the armaments industry, you have to question those who want to go to war and why.
You're listening to the voice of Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. Sheikh Yusuf is the director of the Zaytuna Institute. We encourage our listeners to go to their website, which is www.zaytuna.org. That's ZAYTUNA.org. Sheikh Yusuf, thank you so much for being on Arab Talk. I'm sure we're back.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Salam alaikum.
And we want to wish everyone Ramadan Mubarak
Eid
and
Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak.
Wa antum bi khair.
Stay tuned next week for Arab Talk.